Hey everyone, welcome to the Cyber Hub Engage podcast. I am your loyal host, James Azar. Follow me on Twitter, James_Azar1. And if you're tuning in, make sure you subscribe to our podcast. Give us 5 stars. We have, backed by popular demand, one of my favorite episodes. Patrick Benoit is going to be joining me on the show here today. We're going to be talking about piloting through cybersecurity, an unbelievable episode. It gets better as it goes on. If we didn't have time constraints, we would have probably gone on for a few more hours. But before we get started, just a message from my very good friend Dexter Caffey and Get Smart Eye and the great product they're putting together.
I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, Get Smart Eye. That's Get Smart Eye, like your eye, EYE.com. It's a new security company that's focused on your privacy. How many of you guys have eyes around watching your screens, your phones, your tablets, no matter where you are? It can be your own office, an airport, a train station, a co-working space, and even a coffee shop, right? But there's some documents and some information that really needs to stay away from prying eyes. That's where Get Smart Eye comes in. They're using the latest biometric technology to give you complete control over the documents you send and who sees them. Whether you're viewing them yourself or sending them for someone else to view them, the Get Smart Eye technology ensures that whoever's seeing it is the right person. And should someone who shouldn't see it grab a look at it, it gets the document to disappear and won't reopen it until it verifies the identity of the person you sent it to. So to get more information, go to getsmarteye.com/James. Again, that's getsmarteye.com/James. Again, getsmarteye.com/James.
Patrick, thanks for being on the show, man. Really appreciate you coming back.
Oh, my pleasure. We always have a good time.
Yes, we do. And I got to tell you, so last show you had all the airplanes in the background. You have that again today. And I see we have the Nomad right there.
Yes. That's my Harley Davidson gnome.
It's I saw a really funny meme that is inappropriate for this podcast. And of the gnomes on something, and I'll find it again and I'll send it to you, and I think you'll really enjoy it. It's really fun.
Imagine.
But we've got a lot of really positive feedback from our last show together, and one of the things I've been kind of talking about for a little while, and now you've kind of came on board and you're helping me with this white paper and with this kind of notion of how can we create a world in cybersecurity that is similar to aviation, because the history is very much identical. They're very similar in terms of development, technology, adaptation. Airplanes aren't going anywhere, despite what the Green New Deal says. We're not going to get rid of airplanes, and start working off of whatever positive fuel. Airplanes are here to stay. It's right now the safest and quickest mode of transportation there is. And today we're going to talk about piloting through cyber. Okay. And because you as a chief information security officer, one, and as a second, as a pilot for so many years, there's a lot of similarities. And you're not the only guy. There's a lot of people in security that come from aviation backgrounds. I kind of want to set that for our listeners, because it's really important for them to kind of, if you don't come from aviation, I don't think you understand the similarities, not only in the development of cyber and aviation, but also in the workflow that's almost identical. Is it not?
Oh, it is. And the precision and the attention to detail, lends itself to cyber just as it does to aviation. But, one of the things that is always said about aviation amongst pilots is that, flying is hours and hours and hours of sheer boredom interrupted by moments of sheer panic, and that's a paraphrase from Pappy Boyington way back when he said that. And that's kind of cyber in a nutshell. It's, hours and hours and hours potentially of not finding or not feeling like an incident's occurring. And then all of a sudden you're interrupted by sheer panic because, oh my God, we've got DDoS or their potential data breach or malware or this or that or the other thing. So very similar.
It seems like when you're piloting through cyber, though, there's a lot of different challenges that come with that. Meaning, kind of our topic of our podcast is piloting through cyber, and one of the aspects here, and I had printer problems, so I'm going to have to use my phone for today. Um, so I apologize about that. To our listeners or viewers who may hear me on the phone here and now and then, but pulling up my notes. But one of the things you always spoke about, and one of the common things in cyber is our playbooks,
Hmm? Yes.
which, we call it a playbook. In aviation, they call it a checklist,
Right.
right? When a pilot is coming to land, they pull up their landing playbook, their checklist, and they start to go through that. And it seems like in cyber, whenever I've done a tabletop, it's actually really funny because no one ever takes out their playbook.
It's kind of a scramble. Yeah.
Right, it's more of a scramble, like, oh, let's do this, and it kind of feels like Denzel Washington in the movie Flight,
Yeah.
where he's got no checklist at all. He's just inverting the plane and landing it out in some field somewhere, and miraculously, only a few people die.
Right.
Uh, you know, cyber isn't Hollywood kind of makeup, but how do checklists and playbooks really come together in your experience as a pilot and now as a very successful CISO?
Well, so checklists have been a kind of a foundational thing I like to use, a technique, a tool for, well, as long as I've been flying and as long as I've been doing IT. And it accomplishes several things. One is on the front end, if I go to somebody and I say, hey, I want you to document that horrible word, document this process. You probably end up getting weeks and weeks or months and months of drafts going back and forth and words that are all too much word and too much of this, and it doesn't impact. And then it gets set aside and dust forms on it and nobody ever uses it again. Until the next time maybe you get assessed or audited and you have to pull it out and update it and change the date on it. So that's an ineffective way to document. A more effective way, in my experience, has been to go to somebody and say, hey, here's what I want you to do. I want you to sit down and maybe in a time frame of daily, weekly, quarterly, monthly, quarterly, annually, just keep a little notepad. And when you do something during the day, make a little quick note. Oh, answering emails. Okay, got it. Later on, attending these meetings. Got it. Run this report. Do this analytic. Check this tool. Just whatever. Just like that. And then you do that daily, and at the end of the week, oh, well, here's a report I do weekly. You add that to your weekly. So eventually you evolve this list of activities, your playbook, but it's in a checklist form. So now what you do then is you later go back and say, well, yeah, but here's this one item you do, this one task that's not obvious to everybody. So go write some detail only about this one task, so that we can understand how to do it, do some screenshots, et cetera, et cetera. And that becomes your underlying procedures, a pilot handbook in piloting terms. So we have checklists and pilot handbooks. This is really a checklist or a playbook, and then the underlying procedure that goes with it. And you evolve the documentation, and it's not such a bad word. And that's highly effective in my opinion.
When we talk of checklists and kind of incident management, and our playbook and security, you brought up the kind of like daily, weekly, monthly checklist of just really kind of observing, doing, documenting, observing, doing, documenting, and so forth. It seems like in cyber, like you said, the word documentation just for a lot of people is, it kind of takes the glory away from the job of security.
It's not sexy.
It's not, but what I found very interesting is I've traveled a lot, and every time mid-flight, if I go talk to the pilots and I go, so what do you guys do when the plane's on autopilot cruise? They're documenting, and so explain, how does that mindset come into a pilot? What could security professionals actually learn from that mindset about the importance of documenting that pilots do all the darn time when they're sitting in the cockpit?
Yeah, and that's the other side of the coin. We had the preventative or proactive side of doing documentation and how the checklist aids in doing that. But from an incident point of view, the other type of checklist you should do is what in piloting terms would be an emergency checklist. And so that emergency checklist is, what would we do if we found malware? Boom, 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 boom. Here's the steps that we go through. and then you can write the underlying documentation for detailed underneath it. But the important thing is we have what are called red items on an emergency checklist. And those red items are memory items that when you're flying, you don't have time to pull out the checklist and look for it. So you train to automatically do those red items based on your training and your knowledge. So there's red items with respect to different cyber incidents too. If somebody reports malware, then a red item would be disconnected from the network. Isolate the problem so that you can then work on it. And that's kind of what you're trying to do with these emergency checklists and get you through an incident like that. The other benefit is that if you have this checklist of what you're supposed to do in an incident, both emergency and otherwise, you can use that as an artifact to attach to your incident tickets, your management tickets, your service tickets, and be able to then have an appropriate kind of summary of the forensics and the activities that you went through to resolve the incident. And so you get some real benefit from doing that.
It feels like, the sexy jobs, right? In a podcast I did just earlier this week that we just published with Jeff Felice, who's the CEO of CertNexus.
Right.
Very, very nice guy. Very cool certification kind of what they're trying to do. They're not really competing with ISACA and IC Squared and CompTIA. One of our discussion points was around the kind of career paths that people want to go into cyber. They either want to be the hooded hackers or the Captain America defenders, but no one really wants to do anything in between. It seems like it's difficult to get people who want to do cloud security, right? Or multi-cloud security management and so forth. How do you kind of attribute that with in terms of getting more people interested in that aspect, especially when you consider that aviation, the sexiest job's the pilot. Then it's maybe the flight attendant because you get to travel so much. But then everything else around it, I mean, it doesn't just take a pilot and a flight attendant to get a plane off the ground. It takes the ground crew and the baggage handlers, the maintenance guys, the fuel guys. How do you get more people to be those ancillary roles in cyber?
Well, and if you think about it too, it's a little bit of a reverse progressive path scenario between aviation. And when you talk about the sexy being the pilot, if you look at cyber, the kind of sexy as being the defender or the hacker kind of thing, red or blue team. But most of our people that are, quote, the red or blue team, they kind of start out as, penetration people, pen testers, analysts, things like that. They're already kind of on that side right away, and they move into that kind of a role very, very quickly in their career, early in their career. And generally, unless they really like it a lot, as their career progresses, if they want to advance to leadership and things like that, they move away from that. Aviation is kind of the reverse in terms of piloting, especially. If you want to be a pilot, you might go learn to be a pilot, but then you're probably going to be potentially, a flight engineer, or you might be a second in command and eventually become a first in command. And then you might be a chief pilot where you actually manage other pilots, but you'll still fly some. So you're kind of going in different directions almost. Now, as far as the support roles, well, those are kind of choices. Not everybody can be a pilot. Not everybody can be a red or blue team member, and it's just kind of a choice. But we, as a career, drive our cyber folks to want to do the what we are again calling sexy stuff, the fun stuff, in their youth, and as they get started, and that is the progression path. Because if you do that, then later on you can be this leader that knows how to do all these things, instead of maybe making them go to the other path first and say, well, you got to learn some of the broader scope of security before you can go do the sexy stuff. Now, do I think that'll ever happen? No, but that's the difference I see.
One of the things we always that always comes up with CISOs is in I don't want to say in the event of an event, but when an event is taking place, you're getting bombarded with all kinds of different challenges, right? All kinds of people that want different answers from, managing the situation to actually, I want to say, responding um, to inquiries from media, from executives, from board members, from shareholders, etc. And it always feels like you get lost in the insularies in trying to get answers rather than handling the situation.
Right.
In an emergency on an aircraft, they typically say the pilots don't really talk to ground control unless they have some real answers. So they'll declare an emergency, then they go radio silent until they can figure out what's going on. And that's why sometimes, in aviation incidents, you have that, the black box is so important because now you're hearing the intercommunication between both pilots. How do CISOs how do we learn from that in cyber and then really apply that into cybersecurity?
Well, I think one aspect of aviation that could play in that area is that in the cockpit, especially in a like a jet, a corporate jet or a big aircraft, where you have to have two pilots, two people up there, they always split those duties. So the pilot that's flying the plane is generally not the person that's talking to ground control. That's the second in command. That's the first officer. The person reading the checklist is the first officer and telling the pilot what to do or actioning those things himself if it's a non-flying task. The pilot's not trying to read the checklist and fly. And so it's, in my opinion, it's completely unreasonable to expect that the CISO is going to fly the plane, manage the incident, and at the same time manage the all of the other stuff going on. Talk to ground control effectively, which is all your executives and customers and everything else. So I mean, I think in the places where you can have a deputy CISO, that's a good way to do that, and you split those duties and use that same kind of rationale. But somebody has to be responsible for commanding the incident, and somebody needs to be responsible for communicating with everybody else outside the immediate needs of the incident.
So one of the things we talk about is risk management. Um, the thing about risk management is there's many different ways to manage and handle risk. There's And in cyber, risk management comes to compliance, to securing the environment, to securing data, and so forth. And in aviation, it's no different. You want to secure the perimeter of the airport, right? Your outer perimeter of the airport. That's the airport's responsibility, and so forth. And other bits and pieces of risk management. You brought up something called PAVE. Um, which is kind of like a checklist for risk management. Do you mind sharing what that stands for and a little bit more of how that can really apply into cyber?
Sure. PAVE is just it's kind of a large checklist for what are you doing with respect to risk management, and you're looking at the different things, different aspects of what's going on. So the first one is personal. So in terms of cyber, you might be looking at how the incident or how the attack came about. Was it internal, external? Was there something that somebody inside allowed that to happen? So that's looking at the personal kind of aspects, but that's also going to security awareness and reducing your potential for the people effect with respect to an incident. A is really the aircraft, or in terms of what we're talking about here, it would be your infrastructure and your applications and so forth, your tools. And so you would want to make sure that you have right controls, that you're patching, that you're, all the basic stuff. What equipment you have. A pilot, especially in larger aircraft, knows those aircraft systems pretty intimately. Even if they're not a mechanic, but they still know those systems very intimately. I'm not sure in cyber that we often take the time to really truly know all of the assets that we're trying to protect. You know, it becomes a word back here. Oh, we're trying to protect this data or this set of servers, but do we really know how they react? Now, some of the analysts that are working down in that blue team, red team area, obviously they understand that. But you look at your infrastructure. Uh, the V they use is really just your environment, and you're looking at what are the external factors. You know, are we talking nation state? Are we talking just criminal hacking group? Are we talking just random script kiddie kind of stuff, or what are we talking about? Other external factors you start talking about are, do we have power outages that cause some kind of open physical breach? Possibility. Do we have some kind of external disaster that caused it? So you look at all of those things, and then the last one is external pressures, being regulators, customers, executives, and those kinds of things when you're talking about cyber. So that's kind of that overall. It gives you a framework to look at. Am I looking at all the possible areas of risk management that I need to address?
So that kind of brings us to what I like to call is when you assess risk. It's funny, when I flew to Israel last month, um, the way they manage risk in aviation, leaving and entering the country, is absolutely fascinating. I don't know if you've ever had the chance to fly over there, but getting in is always fairly easy. It's getting out that's always a problem, right? And they're almost like, I think Israel's airport security is kind of like a honeypot, right?
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
like,
yeah.
hey, you can come in. We want to see what you're doing.
Yeah.
Okay, now you want to leave? Not so fast, buddy. Not before we kind of figure out who you really are, right?
Yeah.
And it feels like in security, one of the aspects of managing risk and is the internal external threat levels. It's the, like you were saying at the very end there, is it a nation state attack? Is it script kiddies? Is it internal?
Mm.
Which happens to be more times than not. And if it's internal, is it malicious in nature or is it accidental?
Mm.
All those kind of weigh into that. As a CISO, when you're kind of going through your decision making process, what are some of the things you consider as you're kind of trying to evaluate a moment within an incident?
Well, you actually brought up another cool little metaphor that I hadn't put together before, but the whole honey pot and come on in and let's see what you got, and then we can gather intelligence about you, which is a very effective process. But then the flip side of that is, but we're going to have very, very strong DLP, because we're going to make sure that you can't take anything out that we don't want you to take out. It's two different philosophies. Do we spend all our time trying to brace against the onslaught, or do we, just let the soft stuff come in and analyze it and use it to strengthen our controls, but then just make sure there's absolutely no way something can get out? That's kind of a cool metaphor. But as far as analyzing where you are in any given moment, again, much like flying, we talk a lot about situational awareness. And situational awareness, which I also address in martial arts, kind of the same way. If you turn all of your attention to a specific thing, like, oh my gosh, the engine instrument is showing something in the red, and you just get focused on that, that becomes your world. That's your universe. And you lose track of everything else that's around you. And it's a complete distraction. And we can do that in cyber too. How many times do we, in an instant, we go, oh, it's got to be this. And we start running down this path and we spend hours chasing a red herring effectively, because we were so focused on that. We didn't catch that somebody on some other team in the company asked a question that we never really answered that would have led us to the right solution. So we have to be situationally aware. We have to keep our eyes open, our periphery open. In martial arts, we call it soft gaze. So we're never really focused on any one thing. And that way we won't miss these clues that might lead us in the right direction, and find the answer.
So you kind of brought up, I think, a very interesting. I think something that sometimes is overlooked, which is the situational awareness.
Mhm.
And it feels like the leadership, most of the time, an effective CISO has very good situational awareness. That doesn't always translate to the rest of the team, who may not recognize a false positive over a positive, who may not be aware of various different threats, who, I guess that's the difference between loving what you're doing and doing what you're doing for money.
Mhm.
How do you deal with that? How do you identify that? And how do you kind of put those stop gaps so that, within your team, you're able to differentiate, but you're also able to really have that be effective?
Yeah, and a lot of it has to do with training. So, you should absolutely try and take time to train. And, we say train, train the way you're going to fight, or, train the way you're going to fly. That's why up until recently, flight trainers have not been advanced enough to actually qualify for certain types of your requirements in flying. They've become more and more advanced, and now they do qualify for some of those areas. But it's because they wanted as much realism as possible. So, you do things like tabletops, but it doesn't have to be that big. It can be just having certain specific areas in small bites where you say, again, what do you do if this happens? And the checklist mitigates a bunch of that too, because you don't forget to check something that would have kept you from running down the rabbit hole. So that's all an important aspect. The one thing on the executive side that I don't think we do very often, and I find it to be very valuable, is take the time to not just do, hey, we're going to do a tabletop, and you executive, you have to attend because you need to understand what's going on, and or we'll talk about it in enterprise risk committee. Instead of that, or in addition to that, also have a discussion with the executives about, look, when an incident occurs, this is what it's going to look like to you. Set those expectations about, we're going to take X amount of time to do the analysis. But first thing we're going to do is we're going to, mitigate any additional damage or impact that may require us to take stuff offline. But it's important that we stop the bleeding. Then we're going to do this analysis, but we're going to limit our analysis to X amount of time. And maybe it's an hour, maybe it's 2 hours, maybe who knows what it is. You have to do that on the front end and make that decision. But you tell them, we're going to spend this much time doing this. We're going to give a communication at 15 minutes after we identify the incident to indicate that we've stopped the bleeding, or 30 minutes, or whatever it is. Then we're going to give 30-minute updates that are going to come out. Here's the person that's going to provide you that feedback. We're not going to put you on the incident call because it disrupts the technical nature of what's going on. Happy to have a separate call that this other person, our communications person, will attend and will help flow information for you. And then, at some point when we have made the decision we can't do any more forensics at this point, or analysis, we're going to make sure the system comes back up. It's going to be within our, RTO, RPO. And then once it's back up again, we're going to go into the root cause analysis kind of phase after that. And if you lay that all out for them and set the expectation about what call they're going to be on and who's going to be running that call, I think you save yourself a whole lot of heartache.
So, a lot of very, very good points. trying to break down your answer for me right now is kind of like going through deduction. Which route do I want to go? Right? Like, you put me in not a 3-tongue fork or a 4-tongue fork. You put me in like a 6-tongue fork right now, and I like that because there's so many ways we can go from that. but I feel like in a lot of different cases, right? And I kind of want to kind of maybe not necessarily transition, but kind of take that and you say, well, who needs to be on that call? Who needs to be doing different things? There's a lot of adverse within the team dynamics
Mhm.
in a cyber incident. I think there's always every time I've been in an incident, you've got the ego versus the I was doing my job versus we need to get this handled versus this is really bad versus I don't want to get fired. All these
Right.
different aspects to it. And as you transition from that, do you find a do you find that the opportunity to really not only train and get the right people in the room, do you find that the challenge around that is in training itself, or is it just personalities? I mean, how do you train the different personalities in security?
Well, it can be both. I think we often miss an opportunity too, because if you obviously having been on incident calls, a lot of times when you get inter team kind of stuff
Uh-huh.
going on, you'll have, well, I think it's a network problem. Well, I think it's an app problem. We need to have the app developers look at this because it's code problem, or the network's down over here or whatever. And really, if we can train our security folks, our cyber folks, to change the way they approach those issues, then we might get some better traction too. So the question is, it's not a statement that we think it's a network problem. It should be, have we checked these three things? Again, I come back to checklists. If we had the checklists in place, then our security folks could just simply say, hey, I'm running down my checklist for cyber event, and have we checked XYZ? Have we checked this on the network? Have we checked this? Yes, yes, yes. What were the results? That. And it becomes kind of a rote process and non-offensive, and I don't want to make that this is like political or a sensitivity thing, but you know what? It's how you communicate. So you change that perception, and all of a sudden you have control of the incident and control of the process, and nobody's getting upset about the questions that you're asking.
When you think of the kind of the theory behind seen and be seen or seen and avoid and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
stuff that you and I've discussed previously, and it kind of plays into this is during an incident. Sometimes people want to go in and be seen and let the guys know that hey, we're on to you,
Right.
and sometimes strategically you're like, don't let them know you're on to them, kind of you know watch from a distance, see what they're really after, see if they're after anything, or if we're just a, what you call a man in the middle attack. They're going after
Right.
someone bigger, better. Um,
Right.
how do you, as a CISO, how do you make that decision? What weighs into the see and be seen or see and avoid kind of decision making process for you?
So I think you have to go all the way back to your risk tolerance within the company, and the executives have to give you some guidance on what they're accepting, what they're willing to accept. A set of executives in the company may say, I'm not willing to accept the downtime while you try and lure them in, so to speak. Other executives may say, hey, it makes sense because maybe it's important to our recovery that we know who was actually doing this, or important to our future prevention. So that's the first. It has to be something that the business owns and buys into your process. And then you establish that process. You have a checklist that says we're going to do this for this amount of time, or we're going to have some kind of decision tree that helps us make those decisions like that. You made an interesting point though, and I was going a different direction in that you're looking from the outside in and saying sometimes people you don't want them to know you're onto them yet, and I was thinking in terms also of internally on the incident call. How many people in the company will jump on a call and they want everybody to know they're on the call? And they're interjecting and maybe not adding value. Maybe they are, but maybe not adding value. And they're just slowing down the process. And then you have other people that are sitting on the call like flies on the wall, and they won't say a word, and they probably have something valuable that they could add. So there's a training aspect of that too, is drawing the right people into the conversation. Again, you can have some definitive early in your checklist that say this is the person we need, or a person in this role that needs to be able to answer these questions, and maybe you can guide that some. But I just thought, well, that's an interesting two sides of the coin, inside and outside.
Well, I look at it from your point of view. I look at it from our listeners, our viewers on the podcast who are in security, who are CISOs, deputy CISOs. I feel like that decision making process of who should be on the call, and as you said, the fly on the wall, the typically the smartest guy in the room is the one that's quiet right there in the corner, not saying a darn thing, and he can solve a lot of different problems. But you've got the person who's the "I told you so" person on every one of those calls.
Right.
I told you this is going to happen, all that. And I don't want to get into how we handle people like that, because in the old days, we just take him to the back and shoot him and then bury him.
Yeah.
Nowadays, that's not HR friendly.
Right.
Um, but how do you get those quiet guys in the room to really shine? What's some of the examples you've used before that where you've gotten some of those quiet guys to really kind of speak up?
Again, that starts back before the incident occurs. You know who those people are based on their personalities, and so a good CISO or any good leader is always kind of assessing and notice, not judging, assessing personalities and character and how they work. So good leaders are going to take the time to try and encourage behavior and mentor behavior that's going to be better for the company as a whole and for that person. And so that's where it starts, is you have to train people that are going to give you value. And then when you're in the moment, you have the opportunity to tell the "I told you so" person, understand your point, let's set that aside right now, and then you turn your direction to the person you want to get the real information from. And you may have to do that multiple times. And if you have to do it too many times, then in the chat, you're in the background and you're pinging that person's leader and say, "Hey, I need you to get the 'I told you so' guy either off or under control, because I can't do it." And that becomes a back channel conversation. You don't do it in the middle of the call, because then that sets everybody on edge in the call.
Kind of takes me to something I went through once when I was flying. I was on a flight from Amsterdam to Toronto. And as we were over the Atlantic, I think there's nothing worse than when you hit white turbulence over the Atlantic with no land in sight. Had that happen to me also once on a flight from with the United from Melbourne to LA. There's very little ground under you in that 15-hour, 45-minute flight, and I think the total amount of hours that you're actually over any sort of solid land is maybe 3.5 hours out of a 15, almost 16-hour flight.
Yeah.
And white turbulence is not known to a lot of people. I think those of us who are aviation fanatics or pilots know exactly what that is. It's when no clouds in the sky, it just looks crystal clear, but then you've got white turbulence, right? Am I using the right term?
The actual term is clear air turbulence.
Right. It's just, it comes out of nowhere, but it can
Yep.
it can drop a plane 2,000 feet in just a minute.
Yeah, been there, done that. So yeah.
What is what would you consider to be something extremely similar to that in cybersecurity?
Well, first I would say that there's an interesting saying in aviation also, that I'll paraphrase it, but the two most useless things there are in flying is runway that's behind you and airspace above you. It's absolutely of no value to you whatsoever. So I kind of chuckled when you said there's no land underneath me, because I'm saying I'd rather have a lot more airspace underneath me than have land underneath me anyway right now, to give me some room to operate. But to talk about that coming out of nowhere, that's kind of our life. I started at the beginning of the podcast with the quote from Pappy Boyington that, hours and hours of sheer boredom interrupted by moments of sheer terror, or a few seconds of sheer terror or panic. And that's kind of the same thing right there, is that in cybersecurity, we go on about our business, BAU, we call it, day-to-day activities, business as usual. And we go on and on and on. Obviously, there are some companies, a SOC and entities in a company like a SOC is going to get a lot more day-to-day terror, so to speak. But even in there, they're looking at stuff and they're analyzing, and it's repetitive, and it goes on and on and on, and then all of a sudden something hits, and that clear turbulence occurs, and you just feel like the bottom's dropped out because either the system is wholly impacted, or you realize your heart stops because you realize somebody's been in your system for a month or so, doing the analysis and working to move laterally or whatever the case is, and that's a sheer panic moment. So that's the same thing.
So you brought up another really good point here, and as I'm kind of looking at my notes, it's the disorientation, right? And kind of I like to call it, most cyber attacks are the ones that are intentional, are staged, right?
Mm-hmm.
Could be a DDoS to get you distracted, so you deal with that while something else is happening somewhere else, and that's really monumental. But meanwhile, everyone's running towards the fire exits, and these guys are walking in through the front door because no one's using the front door as a fire exit. Just as an example, how does that work in how does disorientation work in security?
So in aviation, we are trained over and over and over and over again, especially when you're doing instrument training to fly in instrument meteorological conditions, basically clouds, or anything where you can't see outside the plane, that you trust your instruments. In flying, you can put, and as part of the training we give as a flight instructor, we will give training where we'll put the plane in a constant, continuous bank, left turn, say, or right turn, doesn't matter which, and leave it there for 20 or 30 seconds with the person's eyes covered somehow or blocked so they can't see outside, they can't see anything, and then have them open their eyes and then tell us what our attitude is. And because of the way your equilibrium works and everything, your body adjusts to that bank angle, that continuous bank angle, and you think you're right side up and straight. So immediately, if you acted on your sensation, you're going to think you're flying straight and not correct the problem. But if you look at your instruments, it will tell you that, on your attitude indicator, it's going to tell you that you're turned. So at that moment, you have to say, my feelings are wrong, the instruments are right. Now, to make sure that an instrument's not failed, there will be several instruments that you can cross-check against each other. And that's the same in cybersecurity. We look at stuff and we get into a routine of whatever the case may be, and we think, oh, this must be what's going on. This must be, we're normal, everything's okay, there's not a problem. But then we get an instrument, a tool that tells us there's a problem, you need to go look at it. Maybe you've seen that problem a couple times before and it was a false positive. And so now you just assume it's a false positive. And you don't take the time to go check another tool that might give you supplemental information to validate or invalidate that decision. So, and if you get two tools that tell you that that's happening, then I don't care if it was a false positive before, it's probably happening. So you need to act accordingly. So you got to trust your tools. You got to cross-check your tools. Just because something was a false positive one time doesn't mean it's always a false positive.
So that kind of brings me to our to my next set of kind of questions, and kind of deviating a bit off piloting through security, and really kind of focusing a little bit of the CISO being the pilot of an aircraft, and various on the size of organization. You could be piloting a Cessna, a 737. We hope not the Maxes.
Yeah.
And because those have a software problem. And
well, we've seen some of those Maxes in companies, so they nose down and they're gone now. So
yeah. And then you've got the 777s or the 747s, And so as a CISO, when you're kind of put in that pilot seat, you've got a lot of different responsibilities that fall on your head. And we started this entire podcast talking about that checklist, that having all these different checklists that kind of help you kind of manage and deduce and reach the ability to make a very good conclusion. Yourself as a CISO, when you're kind of building your checklist, when you're building your teams, when you're trying to manage all these different moving parts and pieces that you really have no control over. You don't have any control when someone's going to decide to uh, intrude on your network, or when an internal employee feels like he's going to get fired and decides to go and download a bunch of data that he shouldn't have downloaded, or when someone doesn't pay attention that giving access or over access to 400 people in an organization rather than four.
Mhm.
How do you start in your head all of these kind of, I like to call those the moving unpredictable pieces of security, beyond the checklist? How do you start to create the kind of flow to where nothing is a crisis and everything is managed?
Well, and you're never going to get to nothing as a crisis because there's people involved and personalities create crisis. The reality is that and you said not in aviation, but it kind of is. The pilot, um, as planes become more and more complex, aircraft are more
Right.
and more complex. There is a reason why there's a required two pilots, or there's a required flight engineer, or there's a reason why there's required flight attendants and required maintenance people. Everybody has a job, and the team is what makes that whole thing work and makes the flight safe. We're in the same situation. A CISO, in my opinion, that walks in and thinks that they control and own everything is going to have difficulty. That you need to be able to delegate, and you need to be able to own the responsibility when bad things go wrong, but make sure you give plenty of credit to the rest of the team when things go right.
Right.
And so I sound like a broken record, but if you do the checklist and you do the how we're going to do things, you set expectations for timing and for what's going to happen when a crisis occurs and all those kinds of things like that. You work with your team on mini crises practice so that they get that repetitive motion of muscle memory of how to deal with something. But then you have a checklist that allows them to make sure that when they dealt with it with muscle memory that they didn't miss anything. So you have that follow up. And then you have to continuously follow behind what you're doing as a company and in security through assessments, call it assessment or audit or compliance or whatever you want to call it. But those are valuable things. They're valuable only if you use it to identify areas to improve, rather than if you're running around using it to check a box and get a cert of some sort.
So we hear, kind of off topic, you and I did not plan to have this conversation, but you kind of brought up a very interesting point, what you said right now, and I kind of want to take it there, if you don't mind.
No, fine.
Awesome. So we hear of the workforce shortage of trained cybersecurity professionals. My God, if I see another one of those headlines, I'm gonna smack someone. I've actually stopped following pages because I'm
Mm-hmm.
sick of watching these numbers that come out of nowhere. There's no basis. When I go read an article, there's 3.7 million open jobs expected in cyber by 2021.
Right.
Prove it.
Yeah.
Based on what? Where are we getting this information from? Who's putting these headlines together and who's creating this crisis outside of someone who maybe stand to benefit from a workforce crisis?
Right.
We're starting to see, specifically, I think, in the Southeast here, in the Georgia area, more and more companies decreasing the size of their cyber teams. That's
Yeah.
kind of been a trend that's been going on for the last 3 4 months. I'm not hearing a lot of people talk about it. I don't know if it's one of those where let's not talk about something that's happening, but it is happening. And it kind of seems interesting to me that from one end you hear about a workforce shortage. In another end, I see qualified individuals who are in the marketplace for 6 months, 9 months, trying to find their next role. What do you attribute that to in today's security climate? And I know you got to be careful in your answer.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I kind of feel like that's a very pressing question. And before we went live, you and I were talking about something extremely similar that's taken place in Atlanta. There's been about 3 or 4 companies that have laid off a bunch of cybersecurity folks. So it's one of those
Yeah.
where I'm curious where that's coming from.
It could be a few things, I guess. You could say it's as simple as the long-standing mentality that when we have to cut costs, we know we're going to cut people, and when we have to cut people, we cut those people that we think are least essential, which is completely off base. But we end up cutting marketing people, salespeople, people that are generating our revenue. And I think maybe security to some degree falls into that because they say, well, gosh, we haven't had a security incident in a year. So everything's running fine. We can afford to do without these people for some period of time. I don't think it's a valid argument at all, but I've heard people rationalize worse cases than that. Um, it could just be that some executives are feeling comfortable with security now because it's become so mainstream. I got to imagine there are some non-cyber executives out there that feel that they know enough reading the articles in Forbes that they can make those own decisions themselves, and that they can manage it themselves. And probably the last thing is some of it is frankly, I think that we're starting to see, much like we have with ITO kind of experience on technology in general. There's a lot of movement to semi-commoditize the jobs, and so you're seeing, and I've seen a lot more what I would call the ITO kind of shops and staff aug kind of shops for security popping up, and they're selling to the companies as contracted environments. I was dealing with a company the other day that basically has the head of IT, has 5 or 6 security folks working for security, the senior director, VPs, whatever they are, working for them that have responsibility for different siloed areas of security. No one single security person, and then the vast majority of their team is all contractors and staff aug. I don't think that's a viable way to operate, because I don't think, unless you're going to keep your contractors 2 years, 3 years, or whatever, I don't think that you have a good way to transmit and convey institutional knowledge and to be effective. But that could be part of the reason too, is they think that they can do it better with ITO. I'm waiting for the next shoe to drop, which is, hey, we can do it better offshore. If we follow the same course as technologists have followed, we can do it better offshore. The only good news is we have a little bit of mitigation in that, because nobody seems to want their security handled offshore right now. So
No, it seems like national security is very nationalistic in nature.
it
You want
is.
it to be in your office, in your house. If you're going to use a company, you want to be able to get on an airplane or in your car, drive to their office and speak to their staff. You don't necessarily want to do that. And I don't feel like I've heard of people offshore security. I know of several that, use a SOC in India or other places, and they're all leaving. They're all coming back on shore. I feel like that's a trend, um, beyond our political climate. I think that's a trend in security, um, because of those nationalistic threats. Number one. Number two, if you're a multinational, compliance laws in different areas require you to do specific things in different nations in order to operate in them. I believe that in India, you have to store all the information within India. You can't really get it to leave.
Right.
China's the same, Russia's the same. The EU requires you to store all EU data in an EU data center. And so it requires you to make adjustments based on how you operate internationally. But I feel like overall, when you think of building and securing your program, you almost always want to have it at home, and you don't really want to do staff aug. And I feel like that's what's hindering some of our marketplace today is these staff augmentations.
Yeah. But I'm old enough to know also to remember having the exact same conversation about infrastructure and storage, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, where it was the same kind of, it was a nationalistic view. Well, we don't, we want to keep control of our stuff. We don't want it in the hands of other folks. And yet we ran down the outsourcing path and we found that we went too far to one direction and outsourced too much. And then we saw the trend kind of pull back a little bit. And then it finally settled in we're going to primarily outsource certain skill sets or certain skill levels. And that's kind of where it's settled. So I don't think it's unrealistic to think that we could end up running down the same path in security. I'm hoping that that nationalistic view remains, or that the privacy laws, which is a whole nother podcast, right? The privacy laws
Tell me about it.
Regulate us to a point that we don't have that option.
See, so kind of touching on that for a minute, though. I don't know that I want the government to tell me what I can and can't do in business.
I agree.
I actually feel like the U.S. government is missing the point on cyber.
Yeah.
I made that argument in our latest episode of Goodbye Privacy, where one of my arguments was around these GDPR fines, and I kind of compared it to someone breaking into your house and then the cops coming and being like, "It's great that your front door was locked. It's great that your windows were locked, but you left your curtains open, and someone could see inside your house, and they saw something expensive, and they broke the window and came inside."
Yeah. So let's charge you to fix all of that stuff, and I think you need to pay us because we had to make a call.
Right, because we had to drive out here,
Yeah.
Gas, our time,
And by the way, our gas is $20 a gallon because we're the GDPR. Yeah.
Right, we're the GDP exactly, and here we are re-victimizing a victim. We don't do it anywhere else but in security.
Right. I agree.
We don't even re-victimize people who fall for Ponzi schemes. Think of all the Madoff people. I read a really interesting thing on Madoff that they've been able to recover 13.7 billion of the 17 billion dollars they've been trying to recover. That's been claimed as lost.
That's great.
That's not bad. That's great, right?
Yeah.
A lot of it, by the way, was done through cyber forensic work, which is the whole reason I read it, was because cyber forensic work unveils $13.7 billion for Bernie Madoff victims out of the $17 billion claimed. So that's, again, unbelievable. It's great that cyber was able to do something positive to help victims, but here we are victimizing the companies.
Yeah.
Here the government is coming in and saying, you know what? We're going to fine you. Now, if you're negligent, don't get me wrong. My point is the government should have the carrot and stick kind of mentality of we should be able to spank you if you do something bad, but we shouldn't spank you if you did everything right and still something bad happened to you.
Exactly. And our industry or just business as a whole, I would love to see someday some of these mega companies in the technology and in the cyber industry step up and say, or the social media industry is the perfect example, step up and say, we're going to set a standard so that it becomes a self-regulation. And we understand that even though it's going to cost us money to build out a privacy standard that is rigorous, we also understand that that's going to pay us back tenfold in the future through reputation, no losses, no data breaches, et cetera, et cetera.
You don't feel like Apple's already doing that? I feel like Apple's leading the way in that. I mean, the new iOS 13, iOS 13 is, I think, the first operating system ever to not give the developer any access to the user's data, because Apple will generate a unique Apple ID for you, and that's the only thing the user sees. That's the only thing the developer sees.
Yeah.
I feel like that's the right. I feel like Apple, and not because I'm an Apple fanatic, but again, I wrote an article on this. For those listening who really want to read about it, highlighting the good and bad of iOS 13 and how Apple's really trying to be in the privacy business. And Tim Cook continues to say that is we're in the business of privacy. And I think it's different with Apple from everyone else's because Apple relies on selling us hardware. They don't
Yes.
really make a lot of money out of data. They
Right.
make some money out of advertising, but really their focus is data.
Right.
And
Exactly.
really their focus, excuse me, is hardware.
Hardware.
And so they're more concerned with you buying a MacBook Air or an iPhone or an iPad than they are of you using their platform.
Exactly.
And they're starting to be like, hey, maybe more people will use our platform if we give them more control over their privacy. And it seems like iOS 13 is that first step in the right direction. I'm very excited to test it and see how it really works. Um, I've partnered with a few app developers for the new iOS 13 to really see what they see on the other end of it. Is what Apple says true to be true on the back side of it? I think that's going to be the really interesting piece. If I'm signing in with a temporary Apple ID email, um, does the developer really get very few data of only my usage on his app and nothing else? Whereas in today, when you sign into an app using social media, not only does the app get all your social media data, the social media platform gets all the data as well. It's a double whammy.
Yeah. Well, and so now, but what you're going to do, and I applaud Apple for doing that. But now, what you're gonna push up against real soon, as soon as iOS 13 comes out, you're going to start to get the convenience versus security argument again. And how many applications use some portion of your data appropriately to make the application better and more convenient for you? And will
So
this in any way impede that?
I think the one aspect I will say is when you look at general, being that we're both in security, I think you and I both agree that if an employee brought his own device and wanted to put it on our network, would feel far more comfortable with an iOS device than an Android device.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. Yeah, but again, I'm not going to put either on. So that's
Right. But I'm saying if you had to,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
If you had to, you'd rather use an iOS device because at least you know all the apps there have gone through some sort of vetting by Apple and they don't have the amount of malware apps that exist in the Android store. Case in point was FaceApp with all the
yeah,
different apps that popped up that had malware that were just pure malware. And people don't look into that at all. People just don't care. They just
yeah.
download apps and apps and apps and
So I
leave
think
it
Apple
alone.
should continue to do that. They should continue to do things like that. But again, they're the hardware side. Now we need some of the app people to to do the same thing. And if we get enough of those to lead the way, maybe it will follow suit and it will become the self-regulated de facto standard to do certain things.
I mean, I sure hope so. I don't see from just being so concerned with privacy myself. And I watched the Jack Dorsey hearings and the Mark Zuckerberg, and I've read the transcripts. I've not only listened to the hearing because sometimes the transcript gives you a different um, perspective when you're not listening to the voice tone, when you're not listening to the chuckles of the crowd. I always say if you want to know if a movie's really, really funny, watch it alone
Mhm.
because
Yeah,
when
yeah.
you're watching it with a crowd, you're probably going to laugh at what everyone else laughs at.
It's called groupthink. Yeah.
Amen to that. But I think privacy is very similar to that. It seems like social media companies don't really want to self regulate. They're making way too much money from ads. They don't see any point of it being outside of we can deal with the congressional hearings and it disappears because guess what? We control most media outlets anyways, so
Yeah.
we can bury this in our news feed, and that's very true. Think of the Zuckerberg hearings. You barely saw it on Facebook. You saw headlines, but you didn't really see it trending on Facebook as it was on Twitter,
Yeah.
which was very, very interesting. And vice versa, when Jack Dorsey was on the Hill, it was really trending on Facebook, but it wasn't trending on Twitter as much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a straightforward uh, thing that we could do. Will never happen, but we could do it, and it would improve privacy for everybody. And that is to worldwide figure out a way, or at least start in the U.S. to say, if you use a person's data, they get a royalty. Now, maybe it's only a tenth of a cent, a hundredth of a cent, or some ridiculous number, but it could add up. So you want to use it, you get a royalty. The only way you get away from the royalty is you've got to have some kind of, I hate terms and conditions, but you have to have a contract with the person that says, oh, for these specific things, I'm going to allow you to use it without the royalty, or I'm going to change the royalty model. And you create a contracted use situation. Musicians have it, actors in Hollywood and everybody have it. Now, it's never going to happen. It's too big. It's not simple. But if they had to pay for every use of data, guess what? They wouldn't use it so much.
Well, it would limit the amount of companies that would use it.
Exactly.
I think it would limit the amount of risk to your data. That goes back to risk management, right?
Right.
If my data only sits with Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Apple, Microsoft, I know my data is in a controlled setting. The problem you have with it is your data doesn't only sit with Facebook, it sits with all the different apps that you use in correlation with Facebook.
Right.
And then those apps have third-party data analytic firms that are going in and analyzing the data to give them better analytics so that they can do a better app, right? Then the data's sitting there, and lo and behold, that's the real trend of it. My proposal was very simple. I say we need to use the trickle-down effect in cybersecurity. Oh, I did it. I said it. Trickle down. I said it. I Reaganed it. I Reaganed it. I Reaganed it, but I will explain why. If we went to all the big companies as a government, as CISA, we have a body now in the US government, in Homeland Security, the Cyber Infrastructure Security Agency, led by an unbelievable person, Director Chris Krebs, a very, very smart guy. I've heard him speak multiple times. I've met him and had the opportunity to speak to him when we were in Israel as well. Very, very, very sharp man. And I asked him a very similar question. Israel's big corporations, because Israel's a nation that's under constant attack, not just terror now, but cyber. That's why they lead the world in cyber technology. It's not because they're out there attacking everyone. It's because they're getting attacked so often that they had to develop that. I mean, Israel's electric company CISO told me we go through 13 million to 400 attacks every 20 minutes.
Wow.
Run that number in your head.
Amazing.
13,400,000 attacks every 20 minutes on the Israel electric company. Because if you take it down, you take down pretty much all of Israel. Right?
Right.
So the Israeli government did something very interesting. They in cyber, they serve as a business catalyst. So they've allocated resources, but the way they're paying for it, I find to be very interesting. So the big companies are kind of paying I don't want to say a cybersecurity tax, but a cybersecurity fee that's funding the Israeli CERT.
Contribution.
Right. Name it whatever you want. I know in the US, the word tax here for us is like, I don't want to pay any more tax. Exactly. But most of these big corporations, I think, if you talk to the CISOs, are willing to put $5 million each in a bucket to fund a part of CISA that works as a business catalyst to build tools for enterprise companies to protect critical infrastructure. And today, what is critical infrastructure? Beyond our utilities, beyond the AT&Ts, the water, the electricity, and all that. It's Facebook. It's Twitter. When Instagram or Twitter go down, it's trending within 10 minutes. Right. People rely on it. It's critical infrastructure, whether you like it or not. It is. Yep. Around credit agencies, credit reporting bureaus that collect a lot of data. And if all those big companies came together and created led by CISA, again, led by CISA, a new division within CISA that's strictly funded, that then start to create the cybersecurity, not framework also, but tools and affordable ways to start to protect infrastructures. It's the trickle-down effect. The enterprise business is going to take all those tools. It's going to give it to their middle-sized companies. They're going to be like, hey, you want to work with us? You're processing our data. You got to take this. It's already funded by CISA. It's already funded by these big companies. These small companies pay a lesser amount of money to use it. It can be an additional, for the smaller middle organizations, it can be a symbolic contribution or a tax, no different than how you belong to a chamber.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean,
and trickle it down and let CISA serve as a catalyst to defend our organization's infrastructure. Because tomorrow you're a CISO of a Fortune 100 and China or Russia are coming after you, there's nothing in your toolkit that's going to stop them from being successful. They have nation state resources, you don't. And if you don't get over the legal objections within your organization of saying, we're not calling the FBI, we're not calling the Secret Service, we're not calling the federal government, right? Because we don't want this, we don't trust those guys, right? Then you end up in a situation where it impacts jobs, it impacts the economy. The Treasury report from last week said that we're losing $300 million a month in business email compromise.
Yeah.
That's $3.5 billion.
That's a few jobs. Yeah.
That's not a few jobs. That's a lot of jobs. That's a lot of jobs. I mean, you know, if you want to argue the $15 minimum wage hike, I mean, you can all attribute it to the fact that companies can't afford to pay more because they're writing off so much financial loss, because insurance companies aren't going to pay you dollar for dollar, because your insurance premium is going to cost you an arm and a leg.
Yep. Yeah, no doubt. No doubt.
That's my rant. That's my fix.
All good stuff.
I mean, that's my fix. I want to say thanks for coming on again, Patrick. I mean, this has been so much fun. We kind of veered off piloting through security here towards the end, but I loved your concept. I loved your idea of taking this, and I'm excited that you've agreed to co-write this white paper with me on if we could make aviation the fastest and safest way to transport people in the world today, why can't we do the same with cyber?
Yep, exactly.
And I think our listeners are going to be excited to really see this white paper that we're going to put out. And I think we're going to do some talks around it as well. I know that you and I haven't talked about it yet, but maybe submitting it to RSA and a few others. Plus, when I'm in Dallas next month, we can get together and kind of do a really cool rehash of it.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate you being on the show. Any last parting words for our gracious audience that have put up with us for so very long today?
Well, no, always my pleasure. And, you know, like everything, it's the audience that makes this worthwhile. And it's the feedback that we get that makes it worthwhile. So, you know, love to hear from them all the time. Additional topics, comments, you know, whatever they want to provide us. You know, throw stones, whatever works, but we just want to hear from them, because that's what makes the show good.
Absolutely. And if you're a CISO, CIO, someone in security, and you're in the Dallas area, make sure you follow cyberhubengage.com. I am going to be in Dallas. I think Patrick and I are going to get some people together and kind of have a roundtable discussion around security. It will be off the record, first time. We'll kind of do it off the record so we can all speak freely and you don't have to worry about that. But we'd love for you guys to join us. We don't have a date yet, but if you go to cyberhubengage.com or go to any of our social media pages at CyberHubEngage and let us know you want to be a part of it. Patrick and I are going to get a group of people together and kind of try to do these conversations not only on the show and invite you guys to join us, but also kind of privately in Dallas, simply because I go to Dallas so often now that it'd be great for us to just kind of get together and get tacos. Last time I was in Dallas, a friend of mine who works for a very big cybersecurity vendor took me to get tacos. It was Taco Tuesday. And he took me to an area of Dallas where he goes, 3 months ago, you know, a year ago, you couldn't get into this area of Dallas because it was really, really bad. And now they're starting to update it and upgrade it. But the best tacos I've had since,
well, I mean, a friend of mine just opened his second sushi hibachi restaurant, and I've traveled all over the world like you have, and I have found no better sushi anywhere in the world. So
what's the name of the restaurant? Give him a shout out.
The name of the restaurant is Aka Sushi and Hibachi. And he also owns Okada Sushi and Hibachi. Okada is in McKinney, Texas, and Aka is in Allen, Texas.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for being on the show.
I appreciate it.
To our listeners, thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks for listening. And like Patrick and I have said, please give us some feedback. Ask us your questions. If you're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, we are going to kind of do a small meetup in the area for other CISOs, CIOs, CTOs. Even if you're a vendor and you want to come by and just say hello and get some wisdom of how to be more of a partner, we'd love to have you there, because
Absolutely.
we're one community, and our goal is to really break down gaps and not put more hurdles in the way. We need as many people on the issue of cyber as ever before. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back with more next week. Make sure you subscribe and give us our 5-star rating.